everyone kind of knows what we're talking about when we talk about the Dark Ages. But whenever I ask people, when were the Dark Ages, I get completely different answers. It's always roughly around about that kind of medieval time. So it's after the Romans, before the Renaissance. That's sort of what people are talking about. And the general idea is that the Roman Empire collapsed. Before that, we had the Greeks and Romans who were cool because they were, they had bathhouses and central heating and science, and they were wise and smart and stuff. But then along came Christianity, caused the Dark Ages. The Roman Empire collapsed. You had 1,000 years roughly of darkness, superstition, witch crazes, the Inquisition, torture, oppression, the church dominating everything, no science, scientists being burnt at the stake, plagues, all of that stuff. But then thankfully the glorious Renaissance dawned, and we had the revival of ancient Greek and Roman learning. And so we emerged from the Dark Ages, and we had the scientific revolution, the Reformation, and eventually the Enlightenment, and then wonderful us. So it's kind of like, everything was going well, then everything collapsed, and then things recovered. That's sort of the concept of the Dark Ages. But what I want to do is, of course, we're talking about this in relation to atheism, is did Christians ruin everything? And I think that's probably the thing I want to try and focus on. So was there a Dark Age? Well, what I'd say is the answer to that question is yes, and also no. Because, when it comes to history, nothing's straightforward. So was there a Dark Age? Yeah, kind of. I'll explain what I mean in a minute. But did the Dark Age that I just described actually happen? No, unfortunately not. Unfortunately for those who use this argument. But just to illustrate, I suppose, the way many atheists see, obviously not all, this whole concept of the Dark Ages, maybe we could put up the graphic that I was talking about earlier. So you can see along the bottom axis, there's a timeline. So it starts, I think, I'm not looking at it, but from memory, it starts with the Egyptians. Then you've got the Greeks and the Romans. Things are going up because on the other axis, you've got scientific advancement. And then, of course, it crashes around about the point of where Christianity kind of took hold on the Roman Empire. It flatlines. That's the Christian Dark Ages. And then it goes up again after the Renaissance. And, of course, the argument that he's making is that if it hadn't happened, then we would be exploring space and we'd be living on Mars or something by now. The problem with this graph is that you can't measure scientific progress. And if you know anything about, say, Greek and Roman technology and science, the idea that the Romans were vastly or greatly in advance of the Greeks is just pretty dubious. And as we'll talk in a moment, as I'll explain in a moment, the idea that there was this 1,000-year hiatus in scientific advancement is simply wrong. But to get back to your point, Stu, originally the term Dark Age was a Latin term, Saeculum Obscurum, and it basically referred very technically to a period for which we don't have many sources. And it was applied originally in the 17th century to a very specific period in the Middle Ages in the 10th century, where we actually have a very distinct lack of sources, particularly for Italian history. And so he referred to it as a dark age. He said this is a period in which we have darkness because we don't have much information. It later found its way into English and then got applied to the Middle Ages generally as part of this idea that Roman Empire, technology, science, reason, good, Christianity collapsed, bad, and then Renaissance, it became good again. And this was a very common idea, particularly in the 19th century. It took the 20th century for people to actually study the Middle Ages enough to realise that this was wrong. And unfortunately, it's taken a very long time, it's still happening, for this to filter down to the average person. So the average person's conception of history of this period is still very much stuck in the 19th century.